Okay. So we're now up to chapter 5. Oh, hang on. How do I fix that? Okay. So we're now up to chapter 5, which is about, it's about public health, infectious diseases, pandemics, all that good shit. So, chapter 5, Veganism could save your life. I remember watching a news report in the mid-2000s about the spread of bird flu around the world. It featured a map of the world with images of birds superimposed over the countries that were battling outbreaks of bird flu. As the reporter described how the outbreak was spreading, the images of the birds began moving towards the UK. Being only 12 or so years old, I didn't really understand what was being reported, and had little understanding of the potential impact of an influenza outbreak. But I remember feeling an ominous sense of dread that this was an issue of real concern. The prospect of a pandemic is incredibly frightening. Not only can they kill millions of people, but they can cause so much suffering in the process. Infectious disease is in many ways the ultimate existential threat. Unlike the climate crisis, which we've been warned about for decades, infectious diseases can arise at any moment, and within the blink of an eye, change the world as we know it. In recent history, the question around pandemics has been when there will be another one, and not if. However, the inextricable link between our exploitation of animals and the creation and spread of infectious diseases is often overlooked. If we want to ensure that the issue of pandemics is not simply a question of when, we have no choice but to stop exploiting animals. The unprecedented rate of emerging diseases. If there is one thing I'm sure most of us don't want to hear about ever again, it's COVID-19. And yet, the most dangerous thing we could do now is to pretend that it never happened. That's the approach we have taken many times before. But, as we keep learning, infectious zoonotic diseases, originating from non-human animals, epidemics, and even pandemics, will not go away by us simply carrying on as though it is business as usual. Unfortunately, we have a history of being dangerously complacent about the possibility of infectious disease. In fact, in 1948, US Secretary of State George Marshall declared that the conquest of all infectious diseases was imminent. Sadly, this turned out to be nothing more than wishful thinking, with the World Health Organization, WHO, declaring almost 60 years after this statement was originally made that new diseases are emerging at an unprecedented rate. The organization subsequently tracked 1,483 epidemic events in 172 countries from 2011 to 2018 alone. Even though COVID-19 has been a devastating pandemic, resulting in the deaths of millions of people and costing trillions of dollars, leading infectious disease experts and scientists have still referred to it as a dress rehearsal. A senior WHO official declared that the COVID-19 pandemic should be a wake-up call, but warned that it is not necessarily the big one, a term used to describe the Category 5 pandemic that experts dread. For reference, COVID-19 is a Category 2 pandemic. Whenever there is an outbreak of a deadly disease that is effective at human-to-human transmission, containment will always be an incredibly difficult task, especially in a modern world with global travel and densely populated cities. Consequently, the key to pandemic and infectious disease prevention is stopping these diseases from emerging in the first place. But to do that, we have to understand what causes them. It is estimated that about 75% of new or emerging infectious diseases in people come from non-human animals, meaning that our relationship with other animals is of the utmost importance when trying to reduce the risk of infectious disease. Animal farming, in particular, has been linked to an increasing list of outbreaks and diseases. Back in 2004, the WHO, the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, released a joint report in which they listed rising demand for animal protein as being the first point on their list of the biggest risk factors in the creation of infectious zoonotic disease. Since then, the same message has been continuously emphasized by a number of organizations. In 2013, the FAO reiterated their deep concern when they stated that livestock health is the weakest link in our global health chain. So why is it that taking a bite out of an animal could in turn come back to bite us as well? Coronaviruses. On 30 December 2019, Ai Fen, the Director of Emergency Care at Wuhan Central Hospital, received the lab results from a patient she had seen with flu-like symptoms. The results read SARS coronavirus. The Latin word corona means crown, because under a microscope, the virus has a crown-like appearance. Before the 21st century, coronaviruses had caused infectious disease experts little concern, as the known coronaviruses that affected humans at that time were responsible for causing only mild illnesses, such as the common cold. However, that all changed in 2002, when an outbreak of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, began in the Guangdong province of China. The outbreak wasn't just a freak occurrence. Throughout the 1990s, the trade in wild animals for both food and supposed medicine grew rapidly in China due to the expanding middle class and economic transformation that was taking place. This led to the farming of wild animals becoming increasingly intensive, with large numbers of animals being raised in cramped conditions and transported, often over borders from different countries, to live animal markets. In these markets, dozens of species of animals mix. Their blood, saliva, urine, and feces contaminate floors, tables, and other animals, and all in an environment filled with humans, often in densely populated cities. It was these conditions that provided a perfect opportunity for the first truly deadly coronavirus to emerge. Scientists strongly believe that SARS started as a virus in bats, before then being passed to civet cats, who served as an intermediary host in which the virus could mutate and become capable of animal to human and then human to human transmission. Interestingly, although the genetic building blocks for the virus originated in bats, without the civet cat link, the virus might never have gained the ability to lock onto the enzyme coating the cells of human lungs. In other words, the outbreak occurred because of the mixing that was enabled by live animal markets and the wildlife trade in general. In response to the outbreak, the Chinese government initially enacted a ban on the trade of civet cats, but within months that ban had been lifted. SARS ended up infecting 8,096 people, killing 774 of them. Thankfully, it never became a pandemic, largely due to the fact that it always resulted in a fever and human carriers weren't contagious until they started to exhibit symptoms. And even then, the infectiousness of the virus remained low for the first several days of the illness. This meant that robust screenings at airports and self-isolation were able to stop the virus from spreading effectively. The worrying thing was, though, that SARS had a fatality rate of just under 10% and transformed our perception of coronaviruses from little more than an inconvenience to potential full-blown mass killers. A decade later, in 2012, the next outbreak of a deadly coronavirus occurred, this time referred to as MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. The intermediary hosts on this occasion were camels, which had been domesticated thousands of years previously. So, what had changed to facilitate the emergence of MERS? The increasing numbers of overgrazing camels in the Middle East had led to a lack of habitat and resources, so the camel industry had begun to shift to high-density enclosed systems of farming and housing, creating more close contact between camels and humans. In Qatar, the country with the highest camel density in the Middle East, open grazing of camels was banned in 2011, which led to a significant number of camel workers and owners crossing the border to and from Saudi Arabia. 1 year later, the first case of MERS was identified in Saudi Arabia. MERS is even more deadly than SARS, killing 858 of the 2,494 humans it has infected so far, meaning it has a fatality rate of around 35%. Again, thankfully, the outbreak didn't escalate into something much worse due to the virus requiring close contact for effective animal-to-human and human-to-human transmission. Unfortunately, the camel industry's PR campaign, Kiss Your Camel, which was created in response to the Saudi Arabian government's advice to avoid contact with camels and the consumption of camel flesh and milk, and which was meant to deflect blame for the virus away from camel farming, encouraged probably the least advisable action for a virus that spreads to humans who have close contact with the respiratory system of the animals. It was because of these two epidemics that when Ai-Fen received the results from the test she had run, she sent the information to other leading doctors, spreading the message that an outbreak of coronavirus was underway. As we all know now, this outbreak was triggered by a novel coronavirus, one that was fortunately not as lethal as both SARS and MERS, but was, unfortunately, much more infectious. The first known outbreak of this virus was in the Huanan market, which reportedly sold dozens of different wild species, including mammals, who, judging from the fact they had wounds from gunshots and traps, appeared to have been caught illegally from the wild. When environmental samples were taken at the market, over 90% of those that were positive for COVID-19 were found in the section that was selling exotic and wild animals for food. While it is still not definitely known which species acted as intermediary this time, one theory is that it could have been pangolins, who are the most trafficked mammal in the world, killed for their meat and scales. However, it may be some time before we know for sure, as scientists weren't able to prove that civet cats were the intermediary species for SARS until early 2007, over 4 years after the epidemic began. It took until 2017 for scientists to find samples from bats that had all the essential genetic building blocks that make up the human SARS virus, that had caused the epidemic. However, the animal that many infectious disease experts fear the most is not a wild or exotic species. It is, in fact, the land animal that is most exploited around the world. Influenza. To most of us, flu consists of a fever, cough, sore throat, and body aches. However, in 1918, the flu meant something much worse. The 1918 pandemic, sometimes referred to as the Purple Death, is the most severe pandemic in recorded history. It killed 50 to 100 million people and infected 1/3 of the world over a period of 2 years. Although the symptoms were familiar in the early stages of infection, as the virus took hold, millions died from internal bleeding, choking on blood and pus, organ rupture, and in other horrific ways. Pockets of air accumulated under sufferers' skin due to ruptured lungs, causing them to crackle as they turned over, and purple blood blisters appeared, hence the name Purple Death. Unlike COVID-19, fatalities in the 1918 pandemic weren't largely elderly people. In fact, quite the opposite. It disproportionately killed younger people, with the average age of death being 28. The virus killed so many people that it actually brought down the US average life expectancy by 12 years. Survivors recall how cities ran out of caskets, with dead bodies left to rot and mass graves having to be dug. Homeless children wandered the streets, orphaned when their parents were killed by the virus. But what caused it? At the time of the pandemic, little was known about infectious disease and influenza viruses, meaning that for decades there were still many unanswered questions about the origins of the virus. In 1997, in the search for answers, the pathologist John Holton traveled to the tiny Alaskan city of Brevig Mission, where a postal carrier had spread the virus to the small city during the pandemic, killing 72 of the 80 missionaries who lived there. The remaining missionaries subsequently buried the dead in a mass grave. Among the skeletons in the mass grave, the body of a woman who Holton called Lucy was discovered, whose internal organs had been preserved by the cold climate, meaning her lungs could be taken to be studied. This revealed that the 1918 pandemic was caused by a strain of avian affluenza. This discovery was groundbreaking in our understanding of the evolution of influenza, and has importantly helped define what can be done to reduce the risk of such a pandemic happening again. It is now strongly believed that all influenza A viruses, the type of influenza viruses that have pandemic potential, originate from birds, and that the spread of flu from birds to humans first occurred due to the domestication of ducks about 4,500 years ago. In fact, the domestication of animals in general, combined with humans becoming less nomadic and settling in communities, triggered a mass spillover of many animal diseases into human populations. Unsurprisingly, many animals who live in groups are prone to contagious diseases due to the fact that the viruses can spread easily between hosts. However, it is also these herd animals that were most suitable for domestication, which meant bringing many of these diseases into sustained close quarters with humans for the first time. As a result, diseases such as tuberculosis, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, smallpox, influenza, the cold virus, and the list goes on, are thought to have originated from the domestication of animals, with more spillover events happening all the time. The spread of disease during the colonization of North America and genocide of Native Americans at the hands of European settlers illustrates the pivotal role that domestication had on the spread of disease. Before colonization, there were essentially no epidemic diseases in the Americas, and there were no domesticated animals either. While pockets of disease and outbreaks will have occurred, as they would have among nomadic humans in Afro-Eurasia as well, the absence of close, sustained contact between animals and humans meant that spillover events of diseases like tuberculosis, measles, and the flu had simply not happened. When Europeans began to colonize, they brought with them domesticated animals, and, as a result, diseases for which Native Americans had no immunity. In total, Native American death rates from diseases such as flu and smallpox ranged by region from 33% to as much as 90%. But how did influenza become a deadly disease for humans? In its original form, influenza has existed for millions of years as an intestinal waterborne infection in aquatic birds. The virus survived by spreading in the lakes and ponds that the birds frequented, being excreted into the water by the waterfowl and then passing to other birds who were also using the water. The influenza virus didn't make the animal sick because it didn't need to in order to survive and spread. In fact, the birds displaying their natural healthy behaviors was beneficial for the spread of the virus. In essence, the virus had evolved to exist in a form of harmony with its hosts. Aquatic bird influenza has not historically caused serious disease or harm to humans, with only a handful of medically recorded reports of people being infected with the aquatic wild bird virus, which only caused a mild case of conjunctivitis. Scientists have also attempted to actively infect humans with the aquatic wild bird influenza virus, but failed to get it to take hold of the human volunteers, even with very high doses. This, of course, makes sense. The gut of a duck, where the virus resides, is after all very different to the lung of a human. So what changed? With the domestication of animals, the relationship between multiple species drastically altered. All of a sudden, water birds were mixing with terrestrial birds such as chickens, who were not natural hosts, but were genetically similar enough to become infected by the virus as well. However, because the virus was no longer able to spread in the manner it had done for millions of years, via the water used communally by large numbers of aquatic birds, it was forced to adapt to be able to survive. And so, while mutations in the virus in aquatic birds never took hold, in their new hosts, mutations began to change the genetics of the virus, allowing it to spread to different organs of the body, such as the lungs. Once the ducks were able to pass the virus on to chickens and to domesticated pigs, the animals acted as mixing vessels for the virus, allowing it to mutate, going through a process called reassortment. This meant it could lock in the necessary genetic mutations required to then jump into humans and be effective at binding to our receptors. After a virus has infected a new host, it is confronted with an immune response that it has not encountered before. Met with this immune response, the virus is forced to fight for its survival, and in doing so, it can become deadly to its host. However, being too deadly doesn't always work advantageously for the virus. If it wipes out its host too quickly, it limits how effectively it can spread, thereby jeopardizing the ability of that particular mutation to survive. This is why many viruses can become less deadly over time. The process of natural selection works to find the point of relative harmony between a virus and its host that best allows the virus to survive and spread, the sweet spot of lethality and contagion. This is also why the influenza virus has evolved to target the lungs in humans, as it is able to take over the cells, reconfiguring them to make them produce more virus, which helps the virus spread within the body while at the same time triggering an inflammatory response in the lungs that causes a cough. The virus essentially hijacks the body's defense systems to facilitate its spread to other humans. In the case of the 1918 pandemic, the most comprehensive analyses that have been conducted to find its origins point to its beginning in the USA, initially spreading between the Camp Funston military facility in Kansas and Haskell County, Kansas. It is thought that there was a comparatively mild first wave of the virus during the early spring of 1918, with the first recorded cases occurring at Camp Funston. Reports stated that Haskell County smelled of manure because of the poultry, cattle, and pig farms that were there, and at Camp Funston, pigs and poultry were kept at the camp and the soldiers were housed in overcrowded accommodation, providing the perfect opportunity for a spillover event to take place and the virus to spread effectively. It then traveled across the Midwest with the troops as they crossed the country on trains, visiting cities on the way before boarding transport ships and heading to Europe. Later that year, the virus mutated into a killer, taking advantage of the fact that it could achieve its full lethality and contagion potential due to the unusual conditions created by the First World War. It spread through the crowded environments the soldiers were living in, with the uninfected unable to avoid or escape those who were sick. This meant that killing off its host too quickly was less of a disadvantage than is usual, as the virus had access to hundreds of thousands of potential hosts who were immunocompromised, some suffering respiratory problems due to the effects of noxious gases used in the war, and many having weakened immune systems as a result of stress and lack of good nutrition. Then, once the war ended, the virus was able to travel around the globe as the troops returned home. And so a virus that was first recorded in a military camp in the USA went on to kill 50 to 100 million people around the world. It would seem, on the face of it, like the risk of a similar pandemic is small, especially considering it's highly unlikely we will ever replicate the conditions of the First World War. And yet the same kind of environment that facilitated the spread of the 1918 virus now exists all over the world. Not on the Western Front, but instead in every intensive pig, chicken, and egg-laying farm, with millions of animals crammed into tiny, unhygienic, enclosed spaces, immunocompromised and unable to escape from the sick or dying animals around them. We've recreated the trenches of the First World War with our farm animals, not forgetting the people who work with them every day. And the global transport industry can now do an even better job of spreading a virus to all corners of the world than the troops returning to their many home countries and states after the war ended it. In addition, we've gone one better by creating genetically uniform animals through the selective breeding process, which further allows infectious diseases to spread. In the case of broiler chickens, their accelerated growth rate weakens their immune systems, making them especially susceptible to disease. Following the 1918 pandemic, there were two further avian influenza pandemics in the 20th century, and a swine influenza pandemic in 2009. Thankfully, none of them were as severe as the 1918 pandemic, but the 2009 swine flu was yet another reminder that we are always playing catch-up when it comes to our knowledge of influenza viruses. The 1918 pandemic was an H1N1 bird flu virus, which, as well as being passed on by humans, also infected pigs. In fact, the 1918 pandemic was the first time pigs were known to have been infected with influenza, although it is possible that it had gone unnoticed before then. After the pandemic ended, a reassortment of the virus turned into swine flu, and another reassortment became the regular seasonal flu for humans. After a couple of near misses in the 1950s and 60s, something that had never happened before took place in the late 1990s. In North Carolina, a state renowned for its huge number of pig farms, the swine flu virus combined with the circulating human flu and a bird flu to create a triple animal reassortment virus. The virus was then spread around the country by the long-distance journeys that pigs go on as they are transported to different farms and slaughterhouses. By 2005, the virus began to spill over more frequently into pig farm workers, before eventually causing the 2009 swine flu pandemic. It is estimated that somewhere between 150,000 and 575,000 people died worldwide as a result, with 80% of those deaths occurring in people younger than 65. However, infectious disease experts had been fearing something much worse. In 1997, the worst fears of infectious disease experts came close to being realized. That thousands of chickens began dying in Hong Kong, their faces turning black and their bodies shaking as they died, often by choking on large blood clots that were blocking off their airways. When autopsies were carried out, it was discovered that the chicken's internal organs had been reduced to bloody pulp. A couple of months later, in May of that year, a 3-year-old boy was the first human to be admitted to hospital with the virus, where he died from multiple organ failure and his blood having curdled. Tests revealed that he had died from a new strain of avian influenza, H5N1. The second human to die was a 13-year-old girl, whose lungs and intestines hemorrhaged and whose kidneys failed. Disturbingly, the virus was shown not just to affect the lungs, but to target other organs as well, even attacking people's brains and causing fatal comas. This widespread infection throughout the body was something that even the 1918 virus wasn't capable of. Sadly, more capables of H5N1 soon occurred, causing panic among the medical and scientific communities. Once the origin of the illness was traced back to chickens, leading scientists called for every chicken in the entire Hong Kong area to be culled, which they were, and the spread of the disease was subsequently stopped. In total, 18 people were infected and 6 died. Fortunately, the virus wasn't effective at human-to-human transmission, and so was unable to spread efficiently. However, this wasn't the end of H5N1. The virus rose again in the early 21st century and began killing humans in 2003, at which point it spread from Hong Kong and traveled across Asia, emerging in 8 countries simultaneously, due to the wide transportation of chickens in the region. Hundreds of millions of birds were culled. Horrendous methods were employed, such as the animals being burned and buried alive. But this didn't stop the virus, which continued to spread into the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Since its first emergence in 1997, the virus had been mutating, reassorting many times, and becoming more accomplished at spreading. H5N1 even began to infect and kill animals such as pet cats, who had never been recorded as suffering from the flu until H5N1. To date, H5N1 has infected 861 people and killed 455. Terrifyingly, this means it has a fatality rate of around 60%. But thankfully, it has still not acquired the necessary mutation to make it effective at human-to-human transmission, although that could happen at any moment. Every time there is a spillover, there is a risk that the virus has locked in the necessary requirements to spread, in the same way that the seasonal flu does. And if that were to happen, we would be dealing with a virus that would make COVID-19 look insignificant in comparison. H5N1 is a virus that can kill anyone, regardless of age or health. Put into perspective, the 1918 pandemic had an estimated fatality rate of somewhere around 2.5%. If this virus ever did mutate to have pandemic potential, it is likely that it wouldn't retain its horrifically high 60% fatality rate. But even more modest estimates still predict it could have somewhere between a 14 and 33% fatality rate, making it anywhere between 5.5 and 13 times worse than the 1918 pandemic, which was the most severe pandemic in recorded history. The fear is that in the modern world, where the virus resides in animals who are crammed together in barns or on farms, and are in direct contact with humans, and regularly transported through cities to slaughterhouses and wet markets, before coming into contact with people who live in densely populated cities, and are able to move around easily thanks to global constant air travel, the virus is far less limited by its ability to spread. All it has to do is lock in the right mutations, and we'll do the rest. The prospect of anything more severe than the 1918 pandemic is almost too horrific to think about. And yet, while we continue as we are, with the expansion of animal farming and our growing population, the risk grows alongside us. And if a pandemic of this severity were to occur, it wouldn't just be the deaths of the virus caused that we would need to be concerned about. We got a glimpse of what panic can do to people at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people fought over toilet roll and stockpiled food. What would happen if there were genuine food shortages, or there weren't enough doctors and nurses to treat patients because they were dying or were too afraid to come to work? It wouldn't just be the infected who died, but those being treated for other illnesses such as cancer, or those who had heart attacks or strokes but couldn't call an ambulance. What would happen if utilities like internet, water, and electricity were affected? All of this may seem hyperbolic, but the events of the COVID-19 pandemic would have seemed unlikely to most of us before they happened. And the reality is, the only reason we have escaped an H5N1 pandemic so far is because of luck. And yet, at any point, we might be unlucky. The virus might spill over once again, but this time with the mutation to make it as contagious as COVID-19. Following the 1983 H5N2 bird flu outbreak in Pennsylvania that resulted in the culling of 17 million chickens, US poultry farmers began to use antivirals in the water supplies at their farms, even though doing so creates drug-resistant mutations. Rendering antivirals that can treat viruses completely useless to humans in the event of one of these resistant strains spilling over. And all to reduce economic loss from bird flu deaths among the birds. Much to the horror of the world, this is exactly what happened in 2005, when an expose revealed that Chinese poultry farmers had been giving antiviral drugs to their chickens, meaning that H5N1 had become completely resistant to them. However, it's not just H5N1 that poses a risk. In fact, the influenza strain ranked by the Influenza Risk Assessment Tool developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, in the USA, as having the greatest potential to cause a pandemic, as well as posing the greatest risk to public health, is H7N9, a virus that has so far infected 1,568 people, killing at least 616, meaning it has a fatality rate of around 40%. Again, thankfully, the virus has still not gained effective human-to-human transmission. Worryingly, though, there are influenza outbreaks happening all the time, including in poultry farms, and we have even seen human infections, one as recently as June 2021. When it comes to outbreaks of infectious disease, it is easy to point the finger and place the blame on other countries and cultures, something that became very evident at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the risk of infectious disease isn't restricted to Asia, or even to wet markets, though it is worth noting that wet markets also exist in the USA, with more than 80 in New York City alone, and bird flu viruses have been found there. Between 1959 and 2015, the majority of conversions of low pathogenic avian influenzas, strains that pose a low risk of illness and death to chickens and little threat to human health, to highly pathogenic avian influenzas, strains that pose a high risk of illness and death to chickens and a much greater threat to human health, have occurred in Europe and the Americas. So the majority of conversions happened in Europe and the Americas. In the USA, between December 2014 and June 2015, highly pathogenic avian influenza was reported in 242 premises, leading to 50 million farmed birds being culled. We have created a system of agriculture that means we intensively farm tens of billions of birds and pigs every year, animals who are mixing vessels to take diseases that carry almost no risk to humans and turn them into mass killers that could cause the death of hundreds of millions of people. As the WHO stated in a report about avian influenza, highly pathogenic viruses have no natural reservoir. Instead, they emerge by mutation, when a virus, carried in its mild form by a wild bird, is introduced to poultry. Once in poultry, the previously stable virus begins to evolve rapidly and can mutate over an unpredictable period of time into a highly lethal version of the same initially mild strain. Ultimately, we can't rely on the poultry industry to safeguard us, especially when it is their constant priority to make what they do more cost-effective that has caused so many of these problems in the first place. However, there is one important aspect of current infectious disease control that we should take note of. When there is an outbreak, every bird who could be infected is culled. It was this strategy that stopped the spread of H5N1 back in 1997. So, the current method of control already acknowledges the most important aspect of pandemic prevention. When you remove the animals, you remove the risk. By continuously breeding and farming animals, we are putting ourselves in a position where we are forced to be reactive. But all it takes is one slip-up, one spillover event that we can't control, and hundreds of millions of people could die. If we stopped eating poultry products, we could eliminate the part of the process that turns avian influenza into a mass killer. And because the overwhelming majority of chickens are killed at around 6 weeks, within 2 months we would have all but eliminated the biggest threat in the creation of highly pathogenic avian influenza. Stop eating pigs, and within 6 months, we would have all but eliminated the next biggest influenza threat. When you consider the enormity of suffering and death that could be caused by an influenza pandemic, the farming of animals is clearly incredibly dangerous, not to mention needless. Although we might not think about how a bite out of a chicken burger could negatively impact the world in such a profound way, the reality is that our desire for meat could well be what brings our civilization to an end. So, while we may enjoy the taste of chicken and bacon, I'm sure we can all agree that we like our organs not being reduced to a bloody pulp, our lungs being able to breathe, and millions of people not dying from a preventable pandemic even more. I'm going to go to the toilet. I'll be back in less than a minute. I forgot to hit mute on the recording. Oh well. Alright, we're about halfway through the chapter. How much longer have we got to go? Got about 13 pages left, so I should be able to get that done pretty quickly, hopefully. Alright. Deforestation and bushmeat. It's not just the environments in which animals are kept that makes livestock farming responsible for increasing the risk of spillovers. The acquisition of land for farming requires habitat loss and deforestation. This is especially problematic in tropical areas of the world, where disease-carrying animals and insects such as mosquitoes, rodents, and bats, among others, can be found. A novel disease in India that had a 5% fatality rate was linked back to a tick-borne monkey virus, the origin of which was traced to the clearance of forests for cattle grazing. In Brazil, malaria cases have been recorded to be steadily rising in parallel with forest clearing, the expansion of agriculture, the vast majority of which is for animal farming. The Junin virus in Argentina and Machupo virus in Bolivia are both driven by human agricultural activities, mainly animal farming. The spread of yellow fever in Brazil has been linked to increased deforestation. The biggest culprit is, once more, animal agriculture. Then there's Nipah, a disease that has a fatality rate as high as 75%. This was caused by the clearing of forests for agriculture in Malaysia that forced fruit bats to look elsewhere for food. They found trees around one of the biggest pig farms in the country, which led to half-eaten fruit from the bats being consumed by the farmed pigs, causing an outbreak among pig farmers. It is of course important to mention that agriculture is not the only reason for deforestation and increasing contact with wild animals. The logging and mining industries also substantially contribute to the problem. However, the biggest driver of land use and deforestation is animal agriculture, with 41% of global tropical deforestation being caused by cattle farming alone. Then there is Ebola, a truly horrifying disease that can cause internal hemorrhaging and has an average case fatality rate of 50%. The 2014-16 outbreak, which is the worst outbreak of Ebola so far recorded, infected more than 28,000 people and killed in excess of 11,000. It is believed to have originated from the consumption of wild animals, often referred to as bushmeat. It is a similar story for HIV, a disease that is strongly believed to have originated from the butchering and consumption of chimpanzees. Tragically, more than 30 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses since the start of the epidemic, and to this day a person dies from an AIDS-related illness every minute. The issues related to bushmeat, though, are of course very different to those posed by industrial farming. If we all stopped eating poultry and pork, we would remove the two biggest risk factors in the creation of influenza pandemics. But there are other factors at play when it comes to bushmeat consumption. Most of us eat meat because we like it, not because we have to. However, for many people in lower income nations, the consumption of bushmeat is a necessity. A 2016 report highlighted how Chinese and European subsidized fishing vessels were contributing to decreased fish populations in the coastal regions of West Africa, forcing more people to turn to bushmeat for food, which in turn increased the risk of Ebola outbreaks. In essence, our consumption of fish is creating food scarcity for those in low-income nations. So, as well as being a contributing factor to previous Ebola outbreaks, it could also be the cause of the next one. There is, of course, a difference between subsistence hunting and the commercial bushmeat trade, much of which has been made illegal by many countries in Africa. Unfortunately, in the same way that meat eating in Western countries is seen as a status symbol, the same is true of bushmeat in African nations, where for many its consumption is a cultural practice. Because of the cultural aspect of eating bushmeat, large quantities are smuggled out of Africa. It's been estimated that as much as 5 tons of illegal African bushmeat is brought into Europe each week via Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris alone. Some of this bushmeat is then sold at markets, such as the one in Ridley Road in London, where an investigation by the BBC in 2012 found smuggled bushmeat for sale. Another investigation 2 years later revealed that illegal meat was still being sold at the same market. Bushmeat has also been found on sale in other cities across Europe and in the USA. It's not just dead animals that pose a risk in the spread of infectious disease, though. The trade, both legal and illegal, of live animals also creates the potential for disease to spread. The SARS and COVID-19 outbreaks are 2 good examples, as is the aforementioned Nipah outbreak, which was only able to spread so efficiently around Malaysia and into Singapore because of the transportation of live pigs. The first reported outbreak of the Marburg virus in 1967 took place in Marburg, Frankfurt, and Belgrade, and killed 7 of the 31 people it infected. The outbreak was traced back to the importation of African green monkeys from Uganda for animal testing and research. The international trade of exotic pets, a highly lucrative industry worth billions of dollars, also poses a substantial risk. In 2003, an outbreak of monkeypox virus in the USA was traced back to the importation of 800 small mammals into Texas from Ghana. In the UK, in 2005, finches imported from Taiwan for the pet trade were discovered to be infected with H5N1. Fortunately, they were in a quarantine facility, so the disease could be contained. But the illegal trafficking of wild animals and pets is an ever-growing concern when it comes to the spread of infectious disease, especially as it bypasses any regulated quarantine facilities. BSE. I grew up in the aftermath of the BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy crisis. Even though I was too young to remember the crisis itself, growing up I still saw the images of piles of dead cows being incinerated and videos of cows struggling to walk, and I was aware of the ill-fated government mantra that beef is safe to eat. The BSE crisis showed us that nowhere is immune to the dangers of animal farming, and that these issues can start close to home too. But how exactly did BSE come to exist? On 22nd of December 1984, a cow on a UK farm named Number 133 developed head tremors and a loss of coordination. 2 months later, she was dead. At the same time, other cows began to show similar symptoms. BSE, also referred to as mad cow disease, which slowly destroys the brain and spinal cord of cattle and is always fatal, officially became recognized as a new disease in 1986, albeit confidentially. However, because the UK government didn't ban bovine used in human food until the end of didn't ban bovine offal, the cattle parts that could be contaminated, from being used in human food until the end of 1989, this meant that they knew that BSE-infected beef was potentially entering the food supply chain for several years. It is strongly believed that BSE was created because farmers were feeding cattle meat and bone meal, which is the rendered remains of animal flesh that is considered not suitable for human consumption. The meat and bone meal contained the ground-up remains of other ruminants, including cattle and sheep, which has led to the theory that BSE could have been triggered by cattle eating sheep infected with scrapie, a neurological disease, or it could have resulted from a genetic mutation in cattle in the 1970s. Either way, the disease then spread further by the rendered remains of BSE-infected cattle being fed to more cattle. Farmers and feed companies were forcing herbivorous animals to cannibalize simply because it was the cheapest way to feed them. As the number of cases began to increase, the UK government slaughtered millions of cattle, with 4.4 million being culled in total. Unsurprisingly, the British public became increasingly worried that they could be infected by eating beef. So, in 1990, the Agricultural Minister John Gummer attempted to feed his daughter a beef burger in front of the British press to alleviate people's fears. She shied away from the burger, so he took a big bite instead, declaring it absolutely delicious. Unfortunately, 5 years later, on 21st of May 1995, 19-year-old Stephen Churchill became the first known human to die from variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. However, initially his death was listed as being caused by classic CJD, a pre-existing rare neurological disease, with the UK government even going so far as to continue to emphasise that British beef was safe to eat, and refusing to carry out an inquiry into his death, even though there was concern Stephen Churchill's death was related to the BSE crisis. Numerous dairy farmers had also been diagnosed with and died from classic CJD. leading up to Stephen Churchill's death, but the UK government was adamant there was no link to BSE, even though behind the scenes there was growing unease. So it was never discovered whether or not it was the BSE-related VCJD that was the actual cause of their deaths. In 1996, the British government eventually backtracked and declared that the consumption of BSE-infected cow flesh had in fact created a new disease called VCJD. However, by this point, the damage had been done. Nobody knew just how much infected flesh had been eaten. Similar to BSE in cows, VCJD causes neurological decline. Symptoms include hallucinations, loss of speech, bladder control and movement, blindness, confusion, and eventually death. It is a disease that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the actions of the farming industry. As of 2015, there have been 229 known cases of VCJD and 229 deaths. Worryingly, according to The Lancet, there is now evidence that VCJD can lie dormant for more than 50 years. A study in the British Medical Journal showed that as many as 1 in 2,000 people in the UK may be carriers of the abnormal protein that is associated with the disease, meaning the worst of the crisis for many humans may be yet to come. The impact might even be beginning to be felt now, as the rate of classic CJD cases diagnosed has doubled since the mid-1990s. However, most of these people were not given autopsies, meaning there's no way of knowing if it is the variant caused by BSE or not. Additionally, as stated in a report published by the UK government, there is evidence that cases of classic CJD and VCJD could be misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. A leading expert from the Association of British Neurologists went so far as to state that there could be a massive under-ascertainment in the diagnosing of classic CJD and VCJD. This all means that there could be a silent epidemic happening right now. Thankfully, it is now illegal to feed ruminant animals the rendered remains of other ruminant animals. However, it is still legal in the UK for blood products to be fed to non-ruminant animals, such as pigs and chickens. In the USA, poultry litter, which is essentially a mixture of feathers, excrement, spilled feed, and birds who have died on the farms, can be used as animal feed, including for ruminants. This means that poultry litter, used as feed for cattle, could still contain the rendered remains of other cattle, as it can include spilled poultry feed made from cows. Back in 1996, Gary Weber, who was the director of Beef Safety and Cattle Health for the National Cattlemen's Association, defended the practice of forcing cattle to cannibalize by saying, "Now, keep in mind, before you view the ruminant animal, the cow, as simply a vegetarian, remember that they drink milk." Ridiculous, nonsensical statements such as these hardly inspire confidence in the beef industry's willingness or ability to take this issue seriously. Foodborne pathogens. Infectious diseases that arise from our food chain and have the potential to seriously threaten our health are not limited to viruses that mutate and become epidemics, and even pandemics. They can also be found in supermarket fridges all the time. They could even be in your fridge right now. The scale of disease and contamination in our food supply is so vast and normalized that we often don't even realize that there is a problem at all. In total, it is estimated that there are 2.4 million cases of foodborne illness in the UK each year. For example, nearly 3/4 of chicken sold in supermarkets and butchers is contaminated with Campylobacter, a bacteria that can cause vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and even death, with 19% being heavily contaminated. It is even present on 7% of packaging tested. In total, around 280,000 people in the UK are made ill by it every year, with around 100 people dying as a result. The scale of the problem is so significant that in 2014, the Food Standards Agency, FSA, even considered publishing the names of supermarkets and chicken producers and their Campylobacter rates to push them to improve. However, the proposal was initially voted down, with Tim Bennett, the former president of the National Farmers Union, also voting in favour of protecting chicken producers. A year later, the FSA did publish the findings of a year-long testing program that revealed the rates of Campylobacter, even though the UK government unbelievably attempted to pressure the FSA into not publishing them. The government, alongside the poultry industry, was actively trying to hide information from consumers that would have allowed them to avoid buying food that was infested with this potentially fatal bacteria. Not only that, but if the government had succeeded, it would have removed pressure on chicken producers to improve, instead leaving them to self-regulate without any fear of public accountability. This became painfully apparent in 2018, when an undercover investigation was carried out into a Two Sisters food group factory in West Bromwich, which is the largest supplier of chicken flesh to UK supermarkets and producers, 1/3 of all poultry products eaten in the UK. The investigation discovered that the workers there, under instruction from supervisors, had tampered with food safety records, which could have led to consumers being duped into buying a flesh that was past its use-by date by switching labels. The investigation also revealed that workers had altered the records of where chickens were slaughtered, which is extremely dangerous as it makes it difficult to recall flesh if there is an issue with food contamination or disease. On top of this, chickens that had been returned by supermarkets were being repackaged and then sent out again with new use-by dates. This was documented happening with chickens who had been packed for the supermarket Lidl, but were then returned to the processing facility by the retailer. They were then repackaged with pieces of other chickens for Tesco and labelled with the name of one of Tesco's fake promotional farms, called Willow Farms, with the statement that the contents of the pack are reared exclusively for Tesco. It's a similar problem in the USA, where the CDC estimates that around 48 million people get sick from a foodborne illness each year. Testing has shown that 60% of pork products, 70% of beef, 80% of chicken, and 90% of turkey products are contaminated with E. coli. Simply put, fecal contamination is a huge problem for the meat industry, especially as animals in slaughterhouses often defecate because of the fear they feel. The problem is so common that poultry officials in the USA considered using superglue to seal the anuses of birds in slaughterhouses so that there would be less risk of contamination. But even if such a gruesome practice was ever implemented, it wouldn't stop the spread of excrement when the birds are cut up and their organs are pulled out, which can cause the rupturing of the intestines. Chickens are also often plumped as well, a process in which they are soaked or tumbled in water to increase their weight. As soon as the soaking water is contaminated, it can spread to all the other chickens being plumped in the same water. The water is sometimes referred to as fecal soup. But even abstaining from eating animal products doesn't necessarily safeguard you from the problem. as is evident from outbreaks of E. coli linked to the consumption of lettuce, spinach, and other plants. In fact, between 2005 and 2020, there were 40 E. coli outbreaks linked to contaminated lettuce in the USA alone. But plants don't have intestinal systems, so how are they becoming contaminated? Because of manure spreading and water contamination from nearby animal farms. Unfortunately, not even plant foods can escape the disease created by animal farming. One sec. Alright, we're pretty close to done. There's only a few minutes left. Antibiotic resistance. Any bacterial issues we face right now will pale in comparison to what the WHO has described as one of the biggest threats to global health. Unfortunately, as soon the animal farming industries realized that giving antibiotics to farmed animals not only decreased mortality rates, but also acted as a growth promoter, the writing was on the wall. In 1951, the US FDA approved penicillin and tetracycline for animal use, and within just a couple years the same practice was being adopted all around Europe, with many different types of antibiotics being used. Medicated feeds became omnipresent in the poultry industry, with the rise of intensive farming largely facilitated through the mass use of antibiotics. By the end of the 1950s, the same thing was happening in pig farms, and by the mid-1960s, it was estimated that 80% of mixed feeds for pigs, veal calves, and poultry in Germany contained antibiotics. They were even being used by Norwegian and Icelandic whaling vessels, which incorporated antibiotics into explosive harpoons, which preserved the whale meat. By 1970, the use of antibiotics for non-medicinal reasons, such as growth promotion, had increased by more than 30-fold in the USA. In Europe, it was a similar story. In the 1980s, experts reiterated what Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin, had warned back in 1945, when he had stated that the overuse of antibiotics could lead to mutant forms that would be completely resistant to the drugs. However, despite increasing concern, the growth of global antibiotic use in animal farming continued, which was matched by the growth of antimicrobial resistance. For example, 7 years after the FDA approved the use of the antibiotic fluoroquinolones for use in poultry farming in 1995, bacterial resistance to the drug had increased from practically 0 to 18%. Fluoroquinolones are classified by the WHO as being critically important in human medicine due to their ability to treat E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter. In essence, the poultry industry is contributing to the creation of antibiotic-resistant strains of a bacteria that consumers can then catch from eating poultry. In fact, a study from the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control showed that 60% of human Campylobacter cases in EU countries were resistant to ciprofloxacin, a type of fluoroquinolone, with 62% of poultry infected with Campylobacter carrying the resistant strain. God. Between 2015 and 2019, UK pig farms also doubled their use of aminoglycosides, a class of antibiotics the WHO has deemed to be critically important for human health. While some progress has been made in reducing antibiotic use in farmed animals, such as the EU ban on antibiotics as growth promoters, their their use is still unfortunately rampant. In 2016, industry figures revealed that UK farmers had increased their use of fluoroquinolones, which are now banned in the USA, by 59% in 12 months. Globally, antibiotics are still routinely given out as growth promoters, including in countries such as the USA, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, with an estimated 70 to 80% of all antibiotics being used in farmed animals. The so-called antibiotic of last resort, colistin, which is only meant to be used in extreme cases, has also been documented as being used on farms. The miracle of modern medicine is being squandered every day, wasted so that animal production can be more cost-effective. All around us, bacteria are gradually adapting, causing antibiotics to become less and less effective, until we are left with diseases that we are unable to treat. Currently, around 700,000 people around the world die each year due to antibiotic-resistant diseases, with 230,000 of those deaths coming from drug-resistant tuberculosis. The problem is so severe that even urinary tract infections, UTIs, and sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, are becoming resistant to treatment. If antibiotic-resistant diseases continue to increase due to the overuse of antibiotics in animal farming, we could find ourselves in a situation whereby people with cancer would have to decide whether or not it was worth having chemotherapy, as there would be a risk that they could develop bacterial infections for which there is no treatment. In essence, the choice would be, do I want to die from the cancer or from the resistant bacteria? Routine procedures like dental treatments and hip replacements could become life-threatening, and pneumonia could kill millions. A world without usable antibiotics is a world where the infections and diseases we currently regard as being trivial could become deadly. Right now, it is estimated that antibiotic resistance will kill 10 million people each year by 2050. To put that into perspective, the WHO has stated that cancer killed an estimated 9.6 million people in 2018. Thankfully, overall antibiotic use in farmed animals has dropped in the UK in the past half a decade. But globally, it's a very different story. And when it comes down to it, any antibiotic use on farm animals is a waste because of the simple fact that animal farming is completely unnecessary. The number of antibiotics that should be used to keep animals alive, just long enough so that we can kill them, is precisely zero. In the end, we have to decide what we value as being most important: ensuring antibiotics are effective at treating our illnesses, or wasting them so that we can buy cheap animal products in the supermarket. I know which option I would choose. What about you? When does enough become enough? We have created what can only be described as the most absurd and dangerously short-sighted system of food production possible. A system that is one of the main contributors to the degradation of the planet, causes immense suffering, is squandering the most important medicines that we have, and is creating viruses that cause pandemics and could even result in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. At what point do we acknowledge how ridiculous this is? If we experience another pandemic like the one in 1918, when people have to choose between cancer or resistant bacteria, if an H5N1 pandemic happens, will we still say veganism is extreme? In 2020, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, listed the 7 factors caused by humans that are driving the emergence of zoonotic diseases. 1. Increasing human demand for animal protein. 2. unsustainable agricultural intensification, and in particular domestic livestock farming. 3. Increased use and exploitation of wildlife. 4. Unsustainable utilization of natural resources, accelerated by urbanization, land use change, and extractive industries. 5. Increased travel and transportation. 6. Changes in food supply driven by increased demand for animal source food, new markets for wildlife food, and agricultural intensification. 7. Climate change. Of the 7 drivers listed by UNEP, 6 are either substantially or entirely linked to our exploitation of non-human animals. While it is true that the risk of infectious disease spillovers will never be entirely eliminated, our current system of food production and treatment of animals in general is greatly heightening the risk and needlessly causing the emergence of highly dangerous strains of viruses and drug-resistant bacteria alike. Our approach to pandemic and epidemic prevention so far has been to cross our fingers and simply hope for the best. Because in reality, the way that we treat the natural world and animals right now is more in alignment with pursuing the maximization of disease than it is the prevention of global health disasters. We often claim that eating meat is a personal choice, but not only does that statement ignore the impact our consumption of animal products has on the animals themselves, it also ignores the environmental damage and the potential for deadly pandemics caused by diseases transmitted from animals raised for slaughter. While buying animal products in a supermarket might, at face value, seem to be a fairly innocuous decision, the far-reaching consequences are, without exception, inescapable. In essence, our everyday choices in the food that we choose to eat create a ripple effect that is felt globally. Veganism is the only way we can make sure that those seemingly innocuous decisions don't become ones we regret. Alright, that's the end of Chapter 5 on public health, and I'm going to go into the voice chat if people want to discuss it, and then that will be the end of our reading session for this week. So, what do people think?
I got there late, but what I did hear was quite true. I have heard some of those things before.
Yeah, I think it's only recently that, well, there are some public health aspects that I think animal advocates have paid attention to for a while. But the risk of pandemics, I think, is a new concern.
Yeah, because of COVID.
Yeah. So it's interesting that the food we eat and how we produce it is pretty much the worst possible arrangement when it comes to public health, when it comes to infectious diseases and risking pandemics.
Yeah.
I found the comparison really interesting to the World War I trenches, where it's like not only are we doing that with animals, but they're also genetically uniform. So that's another huge issue, is the dramatic reduction in biodiversity, mostly caused by intensive animal farming, is another huge factor in the rapid spread of and mutation of disease. Because species are susceptible to the same diseases. That's one reason why having cows cannibalize each other, either directly or indirectly through chicken litter, is so reckless. is because you can't eat something that's susceptible to all of the same diseases you are.
Yeah.
But putting genetically uniform animals, tens of thousands of them crowded in a shed with terrible conditions, it's the same problem. You might as well have them cannibalize each other.
It makes me like question activist strategy a little bit to hear like how detrimental animal agriculture is to our health.
Right.
Like, you know, we say a lot that, like, you know, veganism is an ethical position on the treatment of animals, on our relationship with animals, full stop. And I think that that's true, but like, does it make sense to try to get people to go plant-based just because like the global health system is totally fucked because of it? I don't know. Maybe.
I think it makes sense on an institutional level, on like a policy level, and like um on a country level. I don't know if it. I don't really see how public health translates to an individual level. Um, the concerns about animal well-being and the oppression of animals, like your individual contribution to that is enormous. It is 2,000 or 3,000 animals. If you add up the duration of confinement, it is at least centuries of suffering, right? And economists have argued in detail that you have a direct impact on that. Your purchases personally will cause or prevent those centuries of suffering, right? So, but for public health, it is just like a very tiny tip on the scale. Like, I don't think I'm at any higher risk of there being a pandemic, whether I personally eat meat or not. It's whether I belong to a society that is trying very hard to curb meat production and consumption through policy and social norms and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think it makes sense when we're approaching any kind of institution or government with this kind of thing, or anyone that has an enormous platform to help change social norms and attitudes. But when we're talking to an individual on the street, they're right to think like, look, I'm not responsible for public health, you know? Like, I'll do more for public health if I wash my hands and wear a mask than if I stop eating meat. And that's probably true, actually.
Yeah, might be the case.
I mean, choking to death on your own bodily liquids sounds pretty horrifying.
Yeah. So the result of that kind of stuff is, but you're not at a higher risk of that as an individual if you're one of the early people to go vegan, right? Or,
No facts.
yeah. You
I
are
really
at risk
enjoyed
of
listening to the book time.
Sorry?
No, I really enjoyed listening to your book time. Though yeah, I listened to like most of it.
The book time?
Probably like 80%.
Which one?
The one that you just had.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it interesting
The UK
way that
stats.
Yeah, the stats are
And
really useful.
yeah, and the deserted forest land, like where it's currently deserted, where it wasn't, you know, like oh, it's just where it's just like a concrete jungle, basically, that kind of thing,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really
So
interesting way of thinking about the landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah. That we should see pastures as what is it? Like a collapsed ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
We've collapsed the ecosystem into pasture, where we have one animal that we want on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof. And then I'm curious the proximity of like slaughterhouses to these lands, because literally in the United States, people will come from fucking Ohio to like Farmer John's for bacon
Hmm.
in California. So it's like, you know, north center of the United States all the way to the southern
Midwest.
California.
Yeah.
It's wild.
He doesn't talk that much about where exactly it happens in this chapter,
Uh-huh.
but from
Oh.
memory, the ecological hoofprint talks quite a bit about slaughterhouses and how the communities right next to, because keep in mind, so slaughterhouses and factory farms aren't going to middle class white communities. They're going to low income communities where it's disproportionately minorities. The reason is they can't afford to politically fight it going there. The other reason is they're desperate for work. And yeah, so there's a huge environmentally racist component to these public health harms, right? Especially when you're considering the localized effects. So the localized effects are hitting minority and poor communities.
Yeah, I'm curious what the sentiment around that is. I mean, that's an independent, political thing, but I'd like to investigate that. Additionally, I'd like to investigate, like, I'm really interested in like live weight conversion ratios. I'm curious some of the environmental sciences and some of the environmental predictions that have shown true with respect to climate change in the UK. Because like I was in London. It was like so fucking humid the last time I was there. I've been to London like 5 times, and it was like I've spent $10,000 probably just so I can have the experience of being in London and hanging out with friends there.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so we read 2 chapters today. One was on the environmental impact, and the other one was on public health and stuff. For the environment, yeah, the ecological hoofprint, I think it talks a lot about conversion ratios and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that would be a good resource for that.
Ooh, here. I'm gonna add you as a friend if that's cool.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
The ecological hoofprint, it's not super long. I think it's like 150 pages, but it's very good. It's rigorous and comprehensive, so it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to just outline the whole thing as well.
Yeah.
Like I can kind of fill in. So just to be clear, we did chapter 1 and 2, and then we're gonna do 3 and 4 next time.
No. So that was, I just finished chapter 4 and 5.
Oh, that was 4 and 5. Okay.
Yeah.
So I can just catch up.
Yeah. If you look at my channel, I've uploaded the other ones.
Oh, is there like a PDF?
Are you an auditory learner?
Partly.
Okay.
I'm also kinesthetic. Really interesting.
Right. There's a have you heard of Z Library?
No.
So Z Library has a lot of free books, and it should be on there.
Okay.
Yeah. So the next chapter. Did anyone want to talk about those 2 chapters anymore?
I'm super down to talk about it. I'm just, I think with the mind state that I'm in is like, I think I only have like 30 minutes. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get a debate, but I want to just spend like a full hour on that. Like just kind of talking about environmentalism as well, and kind of relating everything, because specifically in the UK, I'm pretty aware of anthropogenic climate change in the United States and in South America, And so that would be good to talk about, like,
Right.
right, completely dried out gulfs and basically areas of Southern America that haven't seen water in decades, right? So,
Mm.
what is that going on, and how can we fix that sort of thing? How can we get water in these areas? How can we re-terraform these areas?
So,
right?
is your main interest in how climate change affects the UK, the role of animal agriculture in that, or the prospects for rewilding?
Oh, everything, but specifically, well, dewilding. That's okay. So, just as a point of focus, yeah, yes, and the statistics, like looking at the statistics, kind of just looking at the events surrounding, the some of the, deforestation and you know, like just the ways the
Mm.
industry has taken over. Like, I'm just curious, like, how, to what extent has animal agriculture picked up? And let's see, there was one other thing I'm totally spacing out. Um, I'll come back to you with it.
Okay.
But basically, yeah, public health, that's huge. I was really, I was very interested in what you were saying about masks, because I still haven't gotten the coronavirus just because of how, like, and I like, I'm around people all the time. So like, but like, I'm good at wearing masks. I'm good at social distancing, and I'm not particularly fond of being a vector of plague. I don't know about y'all, but
Yeah, I don't have the science on masks. I was just making a point that
okay.
when you're talking to like a regular person as an individual, public health arguments don't make a lot of sense because there's not much they can do to influence public health. They can have a direct, impact when it comes to washing hands or wearing a mask, but when it comes to purchasing animal products, it's unclear that would actually have an impact. Whereas we can be pretty confident that it has a huge impact on animal welfare.
That's a huge impact on animal. Yeah.
Yeah, because each individual share of impact on animals is centuries of suffering, and economists have explained in detail why it is that your purchases personally cause or prevent those centuries of suffering that are your share, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think they are different, but when you're talking to an institution or a government, or you're campaigning, it can be good to talk about the public health aspects of it. Yeah.
Yeah, like with respect to slaughterhouses, that might be something interesting. And saying at the beginning of the pandemic how people were like 3 feet apart from each other. They're in just horrible conditions. Um, and people like mass amounts of people were just getting coronavirus in slaughterhouses because they didn't retrofit these fucking places, and they were very liberal about their policies. But once we started cracking down, when the Delta variant was around, which I think people fucking forget that Delta about Delta, that when Delta was going around, this was fucking killing people, right? So it's so so slaughterhouse workers were a victim, just like the animals are victims. If we care about animal rights and we care about human rights, and we can't share some like differential between the two that justifies bad treatment for animals but not humans, we're gonna have to like evaluate. Sorry. If you value value humans, then you ought to have certain protections for slaughterhouse workers, for example.
Absolutely.
Not,
So the final section of chapter 3 talks about how much human exploitation there is in the animal exploiting industries, and talks about how slaughterhouses workers in particular are really brutally oppressed. It's probably the worst job, filled by the most disadvantaged people. But so for
like,
your, just quickly,
sorry,
like for
please.
your, because you have a lot of interest and they span really broad topics. I would recommend looking at, there's two really important reports. One is Livestock's Long Shadow, and the other one is Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock.
I'm terribly sorry, but is it possible you can send me some of these things?
Yeah, I can send them to you. I can also link them in this video I'm going to upload, because if people are interested on where to follow up on every other text or resource I mention, I usually just link. So
nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, I've done like video essays before, and most of my stuff is like live debates. Do you know Milk Jar?
Who?
Milk Jar. He's Sverage's friend.
No.
Oh, do you know Sverage?
I've seen some of Sverage. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's like a friend of Sverage. So like I would debate like Milk Jar, like a raw food eater, argues plants are sentient, blah blah, that sort of thing. And then I can run arguments. I can run the arguments that I ran. But so that was fun. And then like this guy named Evil Reflection, who was totally fine with slavery, so that was funny. It took a while to get there, but I just made it look super mask off, because I was building rapport with him, and then I was getting him to concede shit, and then I don't know what it is. I'm really good at making people go mask off. Yeah. So like when it comes to non-veganism, it is mask off when you're just biting the bullet. You know what I mean? It is fucking mask off. You're saying it's totally fine to kill a class of people. Like, I would just say, like, what's the difference between, like, a Jew and a animal that justifies torturing or killing the animal, but not the Jew? Or sorry, yes, yeah, that's right. It's just, it's crazy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up the book club discussion in this session.
Sure. Great.
It's fine that it's gone into other topics, but yeah, I don't want the video to run too long.
Oh yes,
because I'm uploading it.
Oh
for
yes,
for other people.
Sounds great.
Next week is at the same time. It's going to be on the health of veganism. So how animal products or vegan products influence personal health through diet. And I don't know if I'll read chapter 7 as well, which is the influence of psychological barriers. So we've almost finished part 2, which is about how animal products kill everything, like the planet, our health, our diet. And then part 3 is about breaking down the barriers and helping push towards a more vegan world by understanding psychology, media, and conversations. Yeah, so we've read more than half of the book already, which is good. So then we can move on to the next one, whatever that turns out to be. All right. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you next week.
That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, bro.